Petra Lindgren felt the current shift before she saw any change on her wrist display, a subtle drag against her right shoulder that hadn't been there 10 minutes earlier, the kind of thing that meant a passing vessel's wake was working its way down through 80 feet of water toward the pipeline she was welding. She'd been diving commercially for 4 years, long enough to trust her body's read on a changing current more than most junior divers would, but not so long that the trust came without a small flicker of doubt every time it disagreed with the numbers on her wrist, and today it was disagreeing, quietly, the shoulder drag telling her something the display in front of her wasn't confirming yet. The visibility at 82 feet was maybe 6 feet on a good day, and today wasn't quite a good day, sediment stirred faintly by the same current pulling at her weld line, the pipeline itself emerging out of the gloom like the flank of something enormous and patient, cold even through her suit in the particular way deep water is always cold no matter the season above. She didn't stop the weld, not yet, the seam on segment 14 was 3/4 done, and stopping partway through a subsea weld meant redoing prep work that had already cost the crew 2 hours that morning, so she adjusted her stance against the current and kept her torch steady, watching the bead form clean and even along the pipe joint. Topside, in the control van parked on the barge deck above her, Marguerite Solano watched Petra's vitals scroll across the fathom display, heart rate 68, depth 82 feet, time on the seam 11 minutes, gas mix reading nominal, everything green, everything exactly where it should be for a diver 11 minutes into a routine weld. Marguerite had been a dive supervisor for 9 years, and before that a commercial diver herself for 11, trained from her very first open water certification by a man named Otto Voss, who'd pulled her out of a community college welding program at 22 and told her, flatly, that she had better hands than half the divers he'd worked with in 20 years topside and underwater combined. She remembered that first meeting vividly, still, more than 2 decades later, Otto watching her weld a practice seam in a shallow training tank, saying almost nothing the entire session, and then afterward, drying off on the dock, telling her she was wasting her time in a classroom when she should be underwater, and she'd quit the welding program within the month, apprenticed under him for 3 years after that, learning not just the mechanical work but the specific, hard-won judgment that came from watching him make dozens of small decisions in the water that never showed up in any manual, when to trust a gauge, when to trust your own lungs instead. Otto didn't dive commercially anymore, hadn't in almost a decade. He'd taken the money from 3 decades of offshore work and built Aegis subsea systems around a single idea, that divers needed better information than their own gauges and their own gut, and Fathom, the life support monitoring platform running on the screen in front of Marguerite right now, was the clearest expression of that idea. Acoustic telemetry streaming a diver's vitals, gas consumption, and depth in real time from a transponder in the suit to a receiver on the barge, smoothed and displayed clean and legible instead of the jumpy, occasionally dropout-prone raw feed divers used to have to interpret themselves. Marguerite had come up on the old system, gauges strapped to a wrist, a supervisor topside doing math by hand off intermittent radio check-ins, and when Otto had recruited her onto Aegis's clinical advisory board 4 years ago, she'd genuinely believed Fathom was the biggest single safety improvement she'd see in her career. She'd said as much in a testimonial the company still used in its sales materials, her own face and name printed beside a quote about trusting the water again instead of fighting it. The wake from the passing vessel reached Petra's position at 82 feet almost 90 seconds after Marguerite first noticed it register as a minor current fluctuation in the topside data feed, and what neither of them yet understood was that the same turbulence disrupting the water around Petra was also disrupting the acoustic path her transponder used to talk to the barge, sound waves scattering and bouncing off the churned water instead of traveling clean. Fathom's telemetry link didn't drop entirely. That was the part that made it dangerous instead of merely inconvenient. It degraded, packets arriving late and incomplete, and the system, designed specifically to avoid jarring divers and supervisors with blank or flickering readouts during the ordinary brief interference commercial dive sites dealt with constantly, quietly held the last fully confirmed reading on screen and kept it there, smooth and continuous, while it waited for a clean signal to resume. The engineers who'd built that behavior into Fathom, back when Marguerite still sat on the advisory board reviewing early design documents, had called it graceful degradation in the technical specifications, a term that had sounded reassuring at the time, professional, careful, The kind of phrase that made a room full of divers and supervisors nod along in a conference room without anyone asking the harder question of what exactly the system was gracefully degrading into, or how a diver 80 feet underwater was supposed to tell the difference between grace and silence. Marguerite watched a display that still read heart rate 68, depth 82, time on seam holding steady, gas nominal, and had no way of knowing that every number on her screen was now 4 minutes old, frozen at the exact moment the acoustic path had started degrading, presented with the same visual confidence as a live reading because nothing on the interface distinguished between the two. Petra, meanwhile, was finishing the weld against a current that had grown considerably stronger than it had been 10 minutes earlier, her actual heart rate climbing past 90 as she fought to hold her torch steady against the pull, her actual gas consumption rising well above the nominal rate Fathom still displayed topside, and her actual time on the seam running 4 minutes longer than the frozen counter on Marguerite's screen suggested. Segment 14's done, Petra radioed up, breathing harder than the transmission fully conveyed, moving to 15. Copy, 14 complete, Marguerite said, glancing at a dashboard that told her everything was still comfortably nominal, and she almost let it go at that, almost, except that something in Petra's voice on the radio had carried a strain the dashboard numbers didn't match, a roughness at the edges that Marguerite's own 11 years underwater recognized before her conscious mind had finished processing it. Petra, how are you reading on gas? Marguerite asked, more out of habit than concern, the kind of question a good supervisor asks periodically regardless of what the screen says. Fathom's showing me nominal, Petra said, feels heavier than that though, currents picked up down here, I'm working harder than the number suggests. That single sentence was the first thread Marguerite pulled on, because a diver's own sense of exertion and a dashboard reading nominal gas consumption shouldn't diverge, not by much, not under normal conditions, and Marguerite had spent 11 years learning to trust exactly that kind of small mismatch over a clean number on a screen. She glanced down at the analog backup gauge readout, the redundant hardline pressure sensor aegis still required on every dive as a manual cross-check, mostly out of regulatory caution rather than genuine reliance, since Fathom had made the old analog system feel almost ceremonial over the past 4 years. Dust visibly settled on the edge of its housing in a way that told her exactly how rarely anyone actually consulted it anymore, and the analog readout showed a tank pressure noticeably lower than what Fathom's digital display was reporting. She stared at the two numbers side by side for a moment, the ceremonial gauge and the trusted digital display disagreeing with each other in a way that shouldn't have been possible if both were reading the same tank in real time, and felt something cold settle into her stomach that had nothing to do with the barge's air conditioning. Petra, give me a manual pressure gauge reading, direct off your own wrist unit, not through Fathom, Marguerite said, her voice sharpening. There was a pause, a few seconds of Petra checking her own physical gauge underwater, and when she came back on the radio, her voice had lost its earlier steadiness. That's not matching what Fathom's telling you, is it, she said, because I'm reading meaningfully lower than nominal down here, and I think I've been working through a harder current a lot longer than the timer's showing. Marguerite didn't waste time trying to reconcile the two numbers. I want you off the seam and starting ascent prep right now, she said. We're switching to manual decompression calculation off your analog readings. I don't trust what Fathom's showing me. Petra didn't argue, capping her torch and beginning to secure her tools with the particular efficient calm divers learn to keep even when their pulse is climbing, because panic underwater costs oxygen faster than almost anything else, and she trained under supervisors, Marguerite included, who drilled that lesson into her from her first year in the water. Topside, Marguerite pulled the dive tables out from underneath a stack of paperwork on the console, the actual laminated decompression tables nobody had needed to touch in the 4 years since Fathom started calculating everyone's ascent schedules automatically, and she felt a specific, uncomfortable rustiness running her finger down columns of numbers she used to know by memory, math that had lived in her hands for a decade and had quietly atrophied since. Deshawn, the second-year tender working the control van with her that day, watched her pull the laminated sheet with visible confusion. We still keep those, he said, not quite a question, and Marguerite didn't have the bandwidth to explain the full irony of the moment, just told him to get on the radio with the chamber operator and put them on standby, precautionary, while she worked the numbers by hand. Give me your actual bottom time again, off your own dive computer, not Fathom, she said, and Petra read off a number 4 minutes higher than what Marguerite's screen still displayed. For minutes that meant a meaningfully different decompression obligation, a longer required stop at 20 feet than Fathom's frozen, outdated schedule would have called for. Marguerite ran the numbers twice, hands steadier than she expected given how hard her heart was working, and radioed the corrected schedule down to Petra, an extra 6 minutes at the 20-foot stop beyond what Fathom's display was still, even now, quietly recommending, the frozen readout apparently unaware that anything about this dive had ever deviated from nominal. Copy, extending the 20-foot stop, Petra said, and Marguerite could hear something loosen slightly in her voice, the relief of a diver who trusts the person doing the math even when the math is coming off a laminated sheet instead of a screen. If I'd followed what Fathom was telling me, Marguerite said later, once Petra was safely through her stops and climbing the ladder back onto the barge deck, soaked and shaking slightly from cold and adrenaline both, you'd have surfaced 4 minutes early on a schedule calculated off numbers that were 4 minutes stale, and at your actual exertion level today, that's not a small margin. That's exactly the kind of gap that puts a diver in a chamber. Petra sat on the deck for a long moment, mask off, breathing hard. Before she said anything, the screen never even flickered, she said, not once, it just sat there looking completely normal the whole time. I had no idea anything was wrong until you asked me for a manual reading. Neither did I, watching the same screen you were, Marguerite said. Foster, the chamber operator who'd been kept on standby through the ascent, came over with a blanket and draped it over Petra's shoulders without being asked, the particular quiet competence of someone who's seen enough close calls on enough decks to know exactly what a diver needs in the 10 minutes right after one, and Petra pulled it tight around herself and just sat there for a while, staring out at the water she'd just come up from, saying nothing else. She called Otto that evening, from the barge's small galley, phone reception spotty enough that she had to step out onto the deck to get a clean signal, the irony of chasing a stable connection not lost on her. We had a stale telemetry event today, she said, acoustic interference from vessel traffic. Fathom held the last confirmed reading on screen instead of flagging the signal degradation, 4 minutes of frozen data displayed with full visual confidence, no indicator anything was wrong. Otto was quiet on the line for a moment, and Marguerite could picture him exactly, sitting in his office at the Aegis headquarters with the model of Rig 14 he kept on his desk, the platform where he'd worked his last commercial dive before founding the company. How close was it? He finally asked. Close enough that if I hadn't heard something off in her voice on the radio, I wouldn't have pulled the analog gauge at all, Marguerite said. The system was designed to smooth over exactly the kind of brief interference we get constantly on this site, and it did that so well neither of us could tell the difference between smooth and wrong. We built continuity into that display on purpose, Otto said, and there was an edge creeping into his voice now, the particular defensiveness Marguerite recognized from watching him argue with regulators over the years. Divers told us for years that flickering, dropping displays were worse than no display at all, made them second-guess good readings constantly. We solved a real problem. You solved alert fatigue and created silent staleness, Marguerite said. Those aren't the same fix, Otto. I need you to actually hear that instead of defending the design rationale, a diver's actual decompression obligation ran 4 minutes ahead of what your system told her supervisor, and the interface gave zero indication anything had changed. Send me the full telemetry logs tonight, he said, raw, unprocessed. I want to see exactly what the acoustic path looked like during those 4 minutes. I'll have Deshawn pull them before we lose the connection to the boat's uplink, she said, and there was a pause on the line, both of them aware that this was the first time in 4 years she'd spoken to him about Fathom as a problem to be investigated rather than a product to be endorsed. There was a long pause, long enough that Marguerite wondered if the call had dropped entirely, before Otto spoke again, quieter this time. I dove Rig 12 through the tail end of a hurricane once, back before any of this technology existed, worked in emergency pipeline repair on nothing but a wrist gauge and 11 years of instinct, and some part of me built Fathom believing instinct like that was becoming obsolete, that the technology could finally replace what people like me used to have to carry entirely in our own heads. Instinct isn't obsolete, Marguerite said, it's the thing that caught this today. Your system didn't catch it, I did, because 11 years underwater taught me to hear something wrong in a diver's voice that a clean dashboard couldn't show me. I know, Otto said, and there was something almost tired in how he said it, an old man's tiredness rather than a defensive one. I think I spent 10 years building a company partly to prove that the instinct I used to rely on could be made obsolete, made safer, made available to divers who didn't have 11 years to build it themselves, and some part of me needed that to be true more than I let myself examine. The fix took 6 weeks, a persistent, unmistakable staleness indicator added to every reading on Fathom's display, a hard border that turned visibly amber the instant any telemetry stream exceeded even a few seconds without a fresh confirmed packet, deliberately more visually intrusive than the interference problem the original smoothing had been built to solve, alongside a mandatory automatic fallback that pushed supervisors straight to manual analog cross-check protocols the moment staleness crossed a defined threshold, no longer treating the paper dive tables as ceremonial backup but as an active, expected part of the system. Otto flew out to the barge himself once the update was ready, something he hadn't done for a field visit in over 2 years according to the crew who'd worked with Aegis longest, and he spent a full day on deck, not in the control van at first but down at diver level, talking to Petra directly, asking her to walk him through exactly what those minutes had felt like from inside the water. What she'd have wanted to see on her own wrist display in that exact moment, questions Marguerite noticed. He'd never bothered asking a working diver directly in the 2 years she'd sat on his advisory board. Petra, for her part, seemed almost startled that the man whose name was on the equipment she used every day wanted her opinion at all, and Marguerite watched her warm slowly over the course of the conversation, describing in detail the exact texture of the current that day, the specific moment her shoulder had registered a change before any display had, details that clearly mattered to Otto in a way that surprised even him. "Nobody's ever asked me what it feels like when the current shifts before you're strong enough down here," Petra told him at one point. "Everybody wants the numbers, you're the first person who wanted the feeling first." Deschamps hovered nearby for most of the conversation, visibly starstruck in a way Marguerite found almost endearing, Otto Voss being something close to a legend among the newer generation of divers who'd only ever known him as the founder of the company rather than the man who used to work the water himself, and at one point Otto pulled Deschamps into the conversation too, asking him what it had been like watching the numbers freeze from inside the control van, whether he'd noticed anything before. Marguerite had, and Deschamps admitted, a little sheepishly, that he hadn't noticed a thing, that the display had looked completely ordinary to him the entire time. "That's the actual problem," Otto said, more to himself than to either of them, not that Marguerite didn't catch it fast enough, she caught it plenty fast, it's that a system is supposed to work even on the day the most experienced person in the van happens to be somebody less seasoned than Marguerite, and mine didn't account for that at all. "I used to think my job ended once the physics was right," Otto told the assembled crew that evening, standing on the barge deck instead of behind a podium. The acoustic modeling was sound, the decompression math was sound, and I let myself believe that meant the system was sound, and I forgot that a diver 80 feet down doesn't experience physics, she experiences a screen telling her whether to trust her own body or not. Marguerite watched him say it and believed him, mostly, the way you believe someone you've trusted for 2 decades even while noticing, clearly now, the places where that trust had let something slide unexamined for years. She thought about her own advisory board seat on the drive home from the barge that week, for years of testimonials and product reviews and quiet, comfortable faith in a system built by the person who taught her almost everything she knew about diving, and she realized, somewhere on that drive, that she didn't want to sit on that board anymore, not out of anger, not exactly, but because some part of her needed to go back to being the person who checked the analog gauge first and the digital display second, rather than the person whose name and reputation had helped convince other divers the digital display alone was enough. She thought, too, about the testimonials still sitting on Aegis's website, her own younger, more certain face beside a quote about trusting the water again instead of fighting it, and wondered how many divers newer than Petra had read that quote over the past 4 years and let it settle a little more of their own vigilance. The way vigilance settles in anyone who's told often enough by someone they respect that the hard part has already been handled for them. She told Otto as much a week later, over coffee instead of a phone call this time, choosing to say it in person because she owed him that much after 2 decades. "I'm stepping back from the board," she said, "not because I think Fathom's unsafe now, I think the staleness fix is genuinely good work, but because I spent 4 years lending my name to a system I'd stopped independently checking myself. And I don't want to be that kind of endorsement again, not for you, not for anyone." "Do you want the testimonial pulled from the site?" he asked, and she thought about it for a moment before answering. "No," she said, "leave it up, but add a line under it, something honest about what happened this year and what changed because of it. I'd rather divers reading it understand that trust in a system has to be earned continuously, not granted once and left alone." Otto nodded slowly, and there was no argument in his face, just the particular respect of someone who recognized the same instinct in her that had once made him pull a 22-year-old out of a welding program because she had better hands than divers twice her experience. "That's probably the right call," he said, "and for what it's worth, I think it's the same instinct that caught the problem in the first place. I wouldn't want to be the reason it goes quiet again." Marguerite went back to full-time dive supervision after that, no advisory retainer, no quarterly product reviews, just the barge and the crew and the water, and she started every single shift now the same way, checking the analog backup gauges first, by hand, before she ever glances at whatever clean, confident number Fathom is showing her, a habit Petra picked up too, unprompted, within a month of the incident, both of them trusting the screen exactly as much as it's earned and not 1 degree more. Deschamps asked her once, a few weeks after Otto's visit, whether stepping back from the board felt like losing something, given how much the position had meant to her when she first joined it, and she thought about the question longer than she expected to before answering. "It felt like putting something down that I'd been carrying without noticing the weight of it," she said, "for years of telling myself the system was watching closely enough that I didn't have to watch quite as closely myself, and I don't think I even realized how much I'd let that belief settle into how I worked until the day it turned out to be wrong." Otto still calls sometimes, not as often as before, mostly to ask a technical question or float a design idea past someone who's actually stood on a barge deck watching a diver's real vitals diverge from a comfortable, frozen number, and Marguerite still answers, because the respect between them survived even after the trust had to be rebuilt in a narrower, more honest shape than it used to have. He sent her a photograph a few months later, unprompted, an old faded print of the two of them on the deck of Rig 14 more than 2 decades earlier, Marguerite barely out of her teens, grinning and soaked and holding up a torch like a trophy, Otto standing beside her looking, even then, like a man who'd already started imagining the machines he'd eventually build to make sure other divers never had to learn things the hard way the way she just had, and she kept the photograph, propped it against the lamp on her nightstand, a reminder of exactly how long this particular kind of trust had taken to build and exactly how carefully it now needed tending. Some evenings, watching the sun go down over a quiet dive site with nothing on the schedule but routine maintenance, Marguerite finds herself thinking about that 4-minute gap, how completely ordinary it looked on screen the entire time, how close a clean, confident, wrong number came to being the only thing standing between Petra and a decompression injury that would have followed her for years, and she's grateful, every time, that some part of her never fully let go of the instinct Otto once told her she had before either of them had any idea what it would eventually cost, or save.